Okay, so you want to own a Viking longship. Picture it. The dragonhead cutting through fog off the coast of Northumbria, 60 oars rising and falling in perfect rhythm, a crew of hardened warriors at your back, and an entire coastline that has no idea you're coming. You sail where you please. You take what you want. No customs officer, no toll booth, no lord standing between you and the wealth of an undefended monastery. It is, on the surface, the ultimate medieval business plan. Build a fast boat, point it at rich, poorly defended targets, and get rich doing it. Here is the problem. The ship that made you a Viking was also the single most expensive object most Scandinavian families would ever touch in their lives, and it came with a second invisible price tag attached to every single voyage. A price tag that had nothing to do with silver and everything to do with feeding, housing, and controlling 80 armed men who expected to get paid whether the raid succeeded or not. The dragon ship did not make Vikings rich. It made a small number of already powerful men richer, and it bankrupted or enslaved almost everyone else who tried to keep up. So forget the legend for the next 40 minutes. We are not talking about the raids. We are talking about the ledger. What it actually cost to put one of these ships in the water, what it cost to keep it there, and why, for most of the men who owned one. The numbers never quite worked out the way the sagas suggest. Before any of this makes sense, you need to understand the system the Longship was built inside, because Viking Age Scandinavia did not have a Viking navy in any modern sense. There was no treasury cutting checks for shipbuilding. Instead, by the 10th and 11th centuries, most of Scandinavia ran on something historians call the ledang, a levy system where a district, a defined stretch of coastline with a defined population, was collectively responsible for producing and crewing one ship when the king or a local chieftain called for it. Think about it this way. The ledang district was the franchise territory, and the ship was the physical asset the franchise owed to headquarters. Everyone in that district paid into it: timber, iron, rope, food, labor, whether or not they ever set foot on the deck. Ownership of a longship, then, was almost never one man's personal purchase. It was a forced joint venture between dozens of farms, and the owner was usually the chieftain or local strongman who controlled that joint venture and took the lion's share of whatever it produced. Let's start with what it actually took to get one of these ships built and into the water, because this is where the fantasy starts to crack. We have unusually good numbers here, thanks to a piece of very literal, very modern experimental archaeology. In 2004, the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde, Denmark, finished building a full-scale, materially faithful reconstruction of a warship called Skuldelv II, a 30-meter long ship originally built around the year 1042 near Dublin, using oak felled at Glendalough in Ireland. They named the reconstruction the Sea Stallion from Glendalough, and because they built it with Viking Age tools and Viking Age methods, the museum ended up with a real bill of materials for a real longship. The build consumed roughly 150 cubic meters of solid oak. That is somewhere in the range of 300 mature oak trees, each one representing decades of growth on land that could otherwise have been farmed. It required 400 kilograms of hand-forged iron, 3,000 meters of hemp rope, and a sail of 112 square meters woven from wool. The total labor bill ran past 25,000 hours of skilled work. The modern reconstruction cost 10 million Danish kroner, roughly 1.3 million euros in early 2000s money, and that was with donated land, a research grant covering the specialist labor, and none of the opportunity cost of pulling 300s. Prime oak trees out of a working forest. Now scale that up. Skuldelv II was a mid-sized warship carrying a crew of around 60 to 80. It was not the biggest ship in the sagas. According to Snorri Sturluson, King Olaf Tryggvason's flagship, the Long Serpent, stretched some 43 meters, nearly and half again as long as Skuldelv II, which in shipbuilding terms does not mean 50% more material, it means something closer to double, because hull volume and the sheer engineering needed to keep a longer, thinner hull from snapping in. Open water both scale non-linearly with length. A ship like that was not a warrior's purchase. It was a king's flex, built specifically because almost nobody else in the North Sea could afford to build one, and everyone who saw it knew it. Here is the hidden cost nobody puts in the highlight reel: the sail. Boat builders at Roskilde discovered something the sagas never mention, because the sagas were written by men who cared about swords, not sheep. A single square sail of the size needed for a ship like Skuldelev II required wool from a flock of hundreds of sheep, sheared, spun, and woven by hand, a process that, based on the museum's own experimental timings, took longer in total labor, hours than building the entire wooden hull. Read that again. The rope, the timber, the iron rivets, all of that was, in labor terms, the cheap part. The cloth that caught the wind was the expensive part, because textile production in the Viking age was almost entirely manual, almost entirely done by women, and almost entirely measured in years, not weeks. For every hour spent swinging an axe on the hull, Roskilde's researchers estimate something in the range of 2 to 3 hours were spent somewhere on the sail alone. A longship owner wasn't just commissioning a boatyard, he was commissioning an entire textile economy to work for him for a year or more before the ship could even catch wind. Picture the yard at peak build, because this is where the scale actually hits you. Dozens of boat builders splitting oak logs with wedges and axes rather than sawing them, because splitting along the grain produces stronger planks than cutting across it. Blacksmiths hammering out iron rivets by the thousand. A ship this size needed well over 1,000 hand-forged clench nails just to hold the overlapping clinker planks together, each one heated, shaped, driven through 2 planks, and hammered flat on the inside by a second worker in a coordinated 2-person operation, repeated over and over for months. Rope makers twisting 3 kilometers of hemp cordage, and somewhere, off to the side, an entire operation of spinners and weavers working a sail that would not be finished for another year. Based on the modern rebuild's own logged hours, a crew working with only Viking-age tools could realistically complete a ship like this in around 7 months of dedicated, full-time skilled labor, which meant that for most of a year, a significant chunk of a district's most capable craftsmen were doing nothing but this. And here's the cost that almost never comes up in any popular account of Viking shipbuilding: feeding everyone. A build crew of even 20 or 30 skilled workers, plus the woodcutters hauling timber out of the forest, plus the spinners and weavers working the sail, represented a working population that had to eat through an entire building season without producing food themselves. In a subsistence agricultural economy where the margin between a good harvest and a hungry winter was thin, diverting dozens of able-bodied adults away from farms and fisheries for the better part of a year was not a footnote. It was arguably the single largest hidden cost of the entire project, because it didn't show up as an iron bill or a timber bill. It showed up as a hole in next winter's grain stores that somebody, somewhere, had to fill. The ship is finished. Now the real costs begin. Because a longship sitting in a boathouse earns nothing. To make money, or war, it needs a crew, and a crew needs to be paid, fed, armed, and controlled, season after season, whether or not a single raid succeeds. Start with staffing. A ship like Skuldelev II needed roughly 60 oarsmen at minimum, and a full raiding complement, including fighters who didn't row, could push past 80. These were not employees on salary. Most crewmen were paid on a share system, a cut of whatever plunder, tribute, or trade profit the voyage produced, which meant the owner, typically the chieftain who'd organized the lighting district in the first place, was fronting the entire cost of construction and provisioning against a payout that might be enormous or might be nothing at all. If the season came up empty, the owner had still fed and equipped 80 men for months. Then there's security and status among the crew itself, which came with its own informal wage table. A ship's captain or a king's personal herdmen, his sworn household warriors, expected a far larger cut and far better weapons and armor than an ordinary oarsman pulled in from a ladang farm. Saga sources describe herdmen receiving gifts of gold armorings, fine weapons, and land grants on top of their share of plunder, while an average levied farmer oarsman might walk away with a fraction of a share if the voyage even turned a profit, and nothing but exhaustion if it didn't. That gap wasn't incidental. It was the entire incentive structure holding the crew together and maintaining it meant an owner constantly had to outspend on his inner circle to keep the loyalty that made the rest of the crew controllable. Maintenance was relentless. Oak hulls stitched together with iron rivets and caulked with tarred wool or animal hair needed near constant attention. Iron rivets rust, wood dries, cracks, and rots if it isn't kept wet stored or regularly tarred. The Roskilde team, sailing their own reconstruction for over a decade, found that a longship hauled out and properly maintained through the winter could last for years, but one left exposed or one pushed hard through a stormy season could need major plank replacement far sooner, meaning the initial 300-tree, 400-kilogram materials bill was never really a one-time cost. It was a recurring one, on a cycle of years rather than decades, and here is the cost that modern people consistently underestimate. Keeping 80 men fed on open water with no refrigeration and no reliable resupply. A raiding or trading voyage of even a few weeks required enormous quantities of preserved food, dried fish, smoked meat, hard bread, butter, and beer, because water alone spoiled fast in wooden casks. Modern reenactment voyages on the Sea Stallion, sailing with a crew of around 65, logged just how much deck space and hold space went to provisions rather than plunder or trade goods, and the answer was most of it. A longship was, for the majority of its cargo capacity, a floating pantry, first, and a war machine or trading vessel a distant second. Every single warrior on board ate through the margin of profit before the ship ever reached its target. And then there was the advertisement. Spending with no direct financial return, purely to project power, a king or great chieftain launching a new flagship didn't do it quietly. Snorri's sagas describe feasts thrown at ship launchings and before major expeditions involving entire oxen roasted, rivers of ale and mead, gifts of silver arm rings handed out to warriors simply for showing up, and skalds and court poets paid handsomely to compose verses praising the ship and its owner on the spot. None of that fed a single oarsman on the actual voyage or repaired a single rivet. It was pure reputation spending, the Viking Age equivalent of a product launch event, because a chieftain who couldn't be seen to spend lavishly couldn't attract the free, skilled oarsman he needed for the next voyage. The feast wasn't a luxury, it was recruitment marketing, and it was not optional. So how did any of this pay for itself? In the same system, money came in through several distinct channels. The first was raiding itself, monasteries and coastal towns with portable wealth, church silver, and captives who could be sold or ransomed, which is why early targets like Lindisfarne in 793 were so devastatingly profitable. Undefended religious wealth with no army to stop you. The second was tribute and protection payments, most famously the Danegeld extracted from England, beginning with roughly 10,000 pounds of silver paid after the Battle of Malden in 991, and escalating through repeated payments over the following decades until King Sinat's forces reportedly received a payment on the order of 80,000 pounds of silver in 1018, a sum so large it required decades of English taxation to raise and permanently reshaped English royal finance. The third channel was trade. Viking ships were not exclusively warships, and the same hull design that carried raiders also carried furs, walrus ivory, amber, and enslaved people down river routes into the Byzantine and Islamic markets, coming back with silver dirhams by the tens of thousands, which archaeologists still dig out of Scandinavian hoards today. And the fourth, the multiplier that mattered more than any single raid or trade run, was control of a strategic waterway or river route. A chieftain sitting on a choke point, a river mouth into the Baltic, a fjord controlling access to the North Sea, didn't need to win every raid. He could simply tax every other ship that had to pass through his water, turning a single well-placed longship into a permanent toll booth rather than a one-time gamble. But costs spiked catastrophically, under pressure. Take the ladang system itself under wartime strain. When kings like Harald Hardrada mobilized large fleets for full invasions, Harold's own 1066 expedition to England is estimated in some sources to have involved several hundred ships. Every single one of those hulls had to be built or requisitioned, crewed, and provisioned simultaneously, compressing years of normal shipbuilding demand into a single, frantic season. Timber prices in the affected districts would have spiked. Skilled boat builders would have been stretched across far more hulls than usual, and the farms footing the Lidang bill would have been stripped of labor at exactly the moment they needed hands for the harvest. Harold's invasion ended at Stamford Bridge in defeat and his own death, meaning an entire fleet's worth of that spending vanished in a single afternoon, with nothing coming back to the districts that had paid for it. And that points to the actual ruin pattern behind Viking Age shipowning. A bad raiding season or a lost battle didn't just mean no profit. It meant a chieftain had already spent the season's silver on shipbuilding, feasting, and crew shares he'd promised against plunder. That never arrived. To keep his best warriors and his herdmen loyal, he had to make good on gifts and payments regardless, which meant borrowing against future raids, extracting harder tribute from his own farming districts, or selling off land and treasure. A string of bad seasons compounded fast, because a chieftain who couldn't pay his crew lost his crew, and a chieftain without a crew couldn't man his ship, and a chieftain without a functioning ship couldn't generate the next season's income to dig himself out. This is close to the exact mechanism historians point to in the decline of smaller, independent Viking warlords through the 10th and 11th centuries. They were gradually absorbed or eliminated by larger kings like Harold Bluetooth and later Canute, who had the tribute base, the trade income, and the coastal control to keep building and crewing fleets long after minor chieftains had run out of runway. So here is the honest verdict. As a pure financial asset, a longship was a terrible investment for the overwhelming majority of the men who ever helped build or crew one. The upfront cost, measured in oak forests, forged iron, a full year of textile labor, and a diverted workforce, was already enormous before a single oar hit the water. The recurring costs of provisioning, maintaining, and paying 80 armed men season after season ate directly into whatever a voyage brought back. And a single failed raid, lost battle, or bad storm could wipe out a year or more of accumulated profit in an afternoon. For every Canute who turned longships into an empire, there were dozens of local chieftains whose fleets bankrupted them, got them killed, or simply rotted in the boathouse after one expedition too many. But here is the other side of that ledger. A longship was never really priced in silver alone, because what it actually purchased was control. Control over a coastline, control over which farms owed you loyalty, control over whether your neighbors feared or ignored you. A chieftain who owned the fastest, best-built ship on the fjord didn't need every voyage to turn a profit, because the ship itself was the thing that made him a chieftain in the first place, the asset that let him call in the ledong, command, the loyalty of 80 armed men, and sit at the head of the table when tribute got divided. In a world with no banks, no reliable currency outside of raw silver weight, and no legal system that could enforce a contract between rival lords, physical, visible naval power was one of the only forms of wealth that couldn't be argued with. You could lose silver to a bad harvest or a rival's raid. It was much harder to lose the fact that you were the man who owned the dragon ship. In the end, the men who thrived in the Viking Age weren't the ones who built the biggest ship. They were the ones who understood that the ship was never really the investment. The crew's loyalty was, and the ship was just the most expensive way in Northern Europe to prove you deserved it.